and welcome to our second lesson in Chapter 3. You'll recall that when we left off at the end of our discussion of utilitarianism, we raised the question, are consequences and rules the only elements in good ethical decision-making? And so now we'll have a little exploration in search of an answer to that question. And our book starts with, again, with those review of the characteristics of a person with integrity, and numbers, I think, 4 and 5, just to be sure, talk about a person with integrity has genuine respect for themselves and others, and because of that is able to create and maintain healthy, successful relationships. Those things are necessary also for good ethical decision-making and even good ethical learning. So we're going to look at those today as we set forth together here on our outline in our section on respect for others. It says here that when we're thinking about that example of Maria's neighbors from our book, pages, let's see which pages those are. I think in the 40s, yes. Page 49 and 50. Maria goes off on vacation and her lawn begins to suffer from lack of water, and a variety of her neighbors do or do not do something in response to that. Pardon me, we'll use that as our example as we go along and look that when we're working on ethical decision making, we're thinking about things like consequences, which is what the utilitarians focus on. But in this section we'll also consider looking at the intentions of the people. What were the intentions of Maria's friends when they did or did not do something about watering her lawn for her while she was gone? So one person that's going to suggest some options for us to consider is German philosopher Immanuel Kant. I think there's an old story about Kant when he would go for a walk daily in his village in which he lived, and the townsfolk could set their watches by when Kant took off for that particular walk every day. He was a very serious and I guess deliberate man. So he's going to say, let's look at the intentions of a person, of Maria's friends in the example, when we're considering ethical decisions that we need to make. So his first suggestion is what we call the categorical imperative, and we'll do Form 1 and Form 2 in our discussion today. Form 1 of the categorical imperative says basically act only according to the maxim or principle by which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law, that everybody would be that way, everyone would act that way. Now that's the formal definition of the categorical imperative, so let's kind of unpack that like we did the utilitarians and see how we can then use that in our ethical toolbox so that we can use it for our own ethical issues and ethical dilemmas and situations. So according to that categorical imperative, we should act only according to the principles, right, by which you can at the same time will that it become universal law. So we'll unpack it. First, we're going to act from principle, not just consequences like those utilitarians. And we're going to act with what we'll call right intention. In other words, we're thinking like this. We're thinking, I intend to act according to the right kind of moral principle. One that every rational person would accept as universal, would agree to, in other words. And that kind of right principle kind of thing then is both universal and reversible. Universal meaning that principle is going to apply to everybody equally, all human beings, and reversible in that I have to say, okay, and yes, it applies to me as well. I mean, I'm one of the human beings. Pardon me, that it applies to. So our example of Maria's neighbors comes up, And we see they had a basic moral principle that they were going to operate out of. And that was, in certain situations when I'm deciding what the right action is to do, I'll act according to the moral principle, I'll help others. So let's check and see if it meets our unpacking of the categorical imperative number 1 definition here. So that principle, when faced with certain things, I will help others, Maria's friends, then that principle is both universal and reversible. I would want help. If my lawn, I'd gone off for 2-3 weeks on vacation, and my lawn was drying up, my grass was going brown, I would want my neighbors to say, whoa, look, she forgot to turn her water on, her watering system on. So we'll go over and water it for her until she can get back, and we'll save the lawn for her. We'll help her. So because I would want help, I'll help others, is how that's the particular moral principle. So I'm acting on principle, with right intention, and the right kind of principle because it's universal, everybody would do it, and it's reversible, I'm included in that everybody. So when we think about this though, then another question begins to arise, and we think, okay, well look, if I go by like I would want help, so I accept the duty to help others, which is how most of Maria's friends acted, then the question comes up, why would I accept that I have this duty to other people? And Kant has a response for that too in the categorical imperative form number 2. So it's one thing, the first part of the categorical imperative, and the second part is, and when you're deciding how to act, you're going to act so that you treat humanity, whether your own person or others, always as an end and never as a means. And again, that's another formal definition for us here. And so we'll just unpack it briefly here and see what he's really getting at so that we can use this, put this in our ethical toolbox, and use it then to help us in making good ethical decisions. So basically what act so that you would treat humanity, whether in your own person or the person of another, always as an end and never as a means. Never as a means. Here's what we're going to say. We're going to unpack it. Basically, he says, look, you have to look at other people as morally equal, just as equal, as intrinsically valuable. They're intrinsically valuable by means of being a human being. And you'll recall that we've talked about all the different aspects of personhood, and those are already in our ethical toolbox. They focus around cognitive elements like reasoning and self-reflection, and we have a sense of morality, all those things that kind of come from here. They also, as persons, we have in our personhood aspects that are non-cognitive. They don't just come from our intellect. They come from our emotions. We have an emotional life. We feel anger, fear, sadness, pity, things like that. But we also have a spirit-filled life, and that gives us our courage and our conviction and our compassion, among other things that we've also studied in our past section on obligations to clients. We see some of those: honesty, diligence, confidence, those sorts of things. All are come from our spirit, right? And overall, recall that we're trying to figure out the right thing to do, have the motivation to do it, and the appropriate emotional response in that we respond to ethical situations. We don't react to them. So now we see things all coming together here as we move along in our course, and that what's in our ethical toolbox thus far informs what we're studying now here in the categorical imperative. So we have the two forms of the categorical imperative to help us guide our decision making in ethical decisions. We also have that great example of Maria's neighbors, and y'all can try to think of some too. Say, what situations have I been in when this sort of an approach and a method here, respect for others, would have been a very good guiding principle to have. There's 2 decision procedures. Again, this is how we can look to this. We'll put these in our ethical toolbox. We'll be able to look to them when we come across an ethical issue or an ethical dilemma. The decision procedures for respect for others, there are 2. The first one being on page 54. Actually, I think they're both on page 54. But the first one is the universality test, and that comes from the categorical imperative number 1 form. You're going to ask yourselves questions like, what are the morally relevant features of this situation or this issue? And then you're going to say, okay, what are the principles that apply to this situation? Maybe honesty or fairness or, well, just integrity overall. And you're going to say, do these principles fit with categorical imperative 1 and 2? That universality test. It's going to apply to all human beings, and the reversibility one, meaning it applies to you too. And that basically all rational people would agree that this is a good way to act in a situation, like be kind or help others, things like that. Be honest. Lead others with integrity. Don't lead them with dishonesty or mislead them in some way or misrepresent them. And then you would apply the principles that pass this universality test. Would I will it to be everybody would follow this and it would be a good thing to do? Then that passes a test, and that's a principle you can act upon. Decision procedure 2 is that respect test. You ask yourself, based on categorical imperative form 2, you ask yourself, how are people being treated here? Like people with intrinsic value, full human personhood with intellect and heart and emotional life, or are they being treated as employee number 10 or just a worker or, well, you're replaceable? If that's the case, if they're being thought of as replaceable numbers and not persons, then the respect test is not being adhered to. Then the second part of the respect test is, are persons being treated as moral equals? We just talked about that. And the third part is, if that's not the case, if there isn't respect operating here, what must be changed then to make that happen, to have people being treated as intrinsically valuable, who can contribute to the overall outcome, to the overall success of the company or the business. And if not, then you need to make some changes, certainly. So that's basically what we also saw in our lecture about obligations to clients. Those 7 character traits that a professional or business person has who's operating with integrity would also come into play here, and that's why they have also joined all these things in our ethical toolbox. So here we see all our things coming together. We've looked at the decision procedures for utilitarians, their approach to solving for ethical dilemmas and ethical issues. And we've also discussed the Kantian approach with the categorical imperative 1 and 2. And we'll move on in our next lecture to talk a little bit about living virtuously and how virtues then apply to making good ethical decisions. So from the Kiva fireplace, a staple here in the Southwest, my name is T.J. Riley, and I bid you good afternoon.